So I'm going to turn the program over to Esther, who's going to introduce our guest.
I want to take a moment here to thank Professor Robert Lieberman and Professor Ken Pruitt for inviting us to present the first case study of our SIPA Global Case Study Series in Public Policy to the Politics of Policy class. So you are the guinea pigs in this process right now, and I want to welcome all the members of the Workforce Investment Board of the City of New York who are here, and members of the SBS and DYCD, the New York City Department of Small Business Services and Department of Youth and Community Development, who also are here today as part of our class. And of course, I want to welcome my colleague, Commissioner Robert Walsh. We are especially lucky to have him here. We're going to co-teach this case study today, and I think we have a pretty good division of labor in terms of who's going to talk about what, but I won't go into Rob's resume. It's too long, it's too interesting, but it should basically make people feel optimistic about government and the direction that you can take a career in public service. He has done extraordinary things, and probably the most extraordinary thing he's done in his career is take an agency that was nothing more than a footnote in the city bureaucracy and make it, I think, one of the most important and most creative business and workforce service agencies in the country right now. He had a lot of help from very smart people that he hired and from working with the workforce sector and the Workforce Investment Board and the philanthropic and business community. But as you'll see from our case study, leadership counts. Leadership counts in a very significant way. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Rob Walsh. I don't know if he'll say the same thing about me, but we'll see. We'll see. He might say it in public. So this is an extremely timely discussion today, as you all might have already figured out. We are in a national economic crisis, if you haven't noticed. I wish I would have been here for the whole discussion of the presidential election, but I can guarantee you that among the many issues that this president will have to deal with in the very short term is going to be this question of workforce investment policy and our crisis in employment, and both in competing in the global economy. Currently, our unemployment rate is about 6.1% and dropping over the past 12 months. The number of unemployed persons in the United States increased by 2.2 million. And the unemployment rate rose by 1.4%. As of now, New York City has been doing better than the rest of the country, but our unemployment rate is 5.8%. And the city is really on track to lose almost twice the number of private sector jobs than it originally expected in this downturn. And, of course, the problem is being exacerbated by the crisis in the financial service sector. We're forecasting a loss of about 165,000 private sector jobs over the next 2 years. 21% of those jobs are expected to be in financial services. That's 35,000 jobs out of a sector which has about 85,000 jobs. And some of you must have been reading about the impact financial service sector jobs have on New York City's economy. It's estimated that between 2 and 4 jobs are lost for every financial service sector job that is also lost. So we're in for a very bumpy ride, and to the extent that those of you who are in this class today graduate SIPA and start working in the public sector or in the business sector, this is an issue you're going to have to deal with. Several of your former classmates, alum from SIPA, are here today who work for SBS and who have been working for the city, and I hope they tell you about how exciting it is actually to work in government when you're given the opportunity to be creative and innovate. I think the opportunity is there in a crisis almost more often than in other points in time, and we are ready for a crisis now. We are in a crisis now. So where does this issue of workforce development policy fit in to the larger question of unemployment and to the larger questions that we'll be facing for issues of economic growth as we move into the 21st century? People used to talk about job training, and it's become something more than job training. And just to understand briefly and to give you a little bit of background, in the United States, national workforce investment policy has been primarily legislated through the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. Before that, there were several other incarnations of it, JTPA, SIPA, and even one can go back to the Great Depression and Roosevelt's administration for the early versions of what might be considered workforce investment policy. I won't take you through that history, but it is in the case study. And we'll really just begin with WIA, as it is called, the Workforce Investment Act. What WIA does, and I think, as you'll see, not sufficiently, is provide funding and regulations for this workforce development system, which is implemented and managed by state and local government. That should, immediately create lights and bells and sirens in your head when you hear about federal legislation which creates regulations and provides funding, but the implementation happens at the state and local level. You immediately have to understand that the issues you address in this course are going to be the most important issues in dealing in this policy arena. This is a perfect case study for politics of policy, as you've been talking about it all semester, because you first and primarily will have the question of federalism to deal with. What is the role of the federal government in the regulatory policy and in the funding? And you can be sure when the federal government comes in and regulates and provides funding, there's one thing you can be sure of. Anybody take a guess? When you look at the policy on the ground, one thing that they will be doing inadequately. You only get one guess. Somebody's going to tell me. Or I'm going to call on somebody because I actually know a couple of you. What is likely to be the case when the federal government engages in this kind of approach to policy, when you look on the ground and you have to implement? What's usually insufficient? Thank you. Say it a little louder so we can get it on the recording. Go ahead.
I said funding.
You said funding. You are correct. And this is not rocket science, right? Generally speaking, it's not that hard to create regulations, and it's sometimes not even that hard to create policy. What's really hard is to get enough money on the table so you can actually do a good job, and to figure out what a good job looks like, to figure out the implementation of that policy down the road. So again, I'm telling you, when it's intergovernmental relations and the federal government leads, you can be sure that the cities and state governments will be in a position in which they have to deal with the crises on the ground, with the demands on the ground, but will have insufficient resources to get the work done. So in workforce development, it's no different than in virtually any other arena where the federal government comes in and dictates policy. The policy model is pretty interesting and pretty straightforward. At the core of a workforce system are programs and services that are designed to evaluate the skills and capacity of the unemployed or underemployed and match them with employment opportunities or training, so that we can bridge the gap between education and skills and what is needed to meet the economic development goals of the local economy. Simply put, on the supply side, workforce development offers individuals occupational preparation and employment. And this can include teaching from anything from teaching technical, basic, or academic skills to counseling, job recruitment, and, of course, placement in jobs. And I say, of course, placement in jobs because that's actually not that easy. sometimes it's easier to just do the courses and forget about the placement, as we'll see when we look at the New York City case. But on the demand side, workforce focuses on the needs of the employers, and this is a new sort of revelatory approach in workforce development policy. Yes, it's about those folks who have to be retrained. It's about those individuals seeking employment. But yes, it's also about businesses. It's also about the needs of employers and their aims and what they think education, job training, and work supports should look like. And in the end, the idea was the design of this system should be something that could facilitate matching the needs of employers, not just going in there and training people and saying, go ahead, have a nice life, get a job. There was some attempt to do systemic policy here. And what we know, and what you should know, of course, is that, good economists can actually look at the economy, local, state, or national, and predict what the growth sectors in the economy will look like, where the jobs will be. And in a well-functioning workforce system, people should not be in there just going into training programs, but there should be some sense that they're actually being trained and being readied for jobs that exist in the local economy. And that's part of the reason why you need to implement on the ground, and you need to have some really serious understanding of what the local economy looks like. This is a policy area that you can't really frame at the national level, because the United States, again because of the federal system, has so many regional economies and local economies that to look at this as simply one economy for the nation would really miss all the energy that's going on in different local areas. So the other important part of this system is the role of government here. The role of government is intended to hold workforce providers accountable for something we like to say, real outcomes, so that the number and quality of job placements become the primary measures of an effective workforce policy. Now, for those of you who are still, taking classes, that should sound like Public Management 101. We need to develop an evaluation system, and that the measures for effective evaluation should somehow reflect something real on the ground. As we go through some of this story, you'll realize, A, it's not that easy, and B, that's not what was going on. In the workforce system, this is a contract system in which most of the work is done not by government itself, but by contract providers who compete in an RFP process for contracts to provide the services that are needed to construct a workforce system. And the reality is the role of government here is really sort of regulatory, and it's also capacity building and also policy and planning. But the truth is that the relationship between government and the contract providers is something that historically hadn't really worked that well or hadn't been that serious. And this is a very, very important point to understand in general about the issue of when you contract out services, what is the role of government? At the local level, we have some very clear models, or we had them before the big privatization explosion. And they were models like you had essentially police, fire, sanitation. The thing about police, fire, and sanitation, which are basic local government services, who do police folks, fires, and sanitation workers, who do they work for? It's not a trick question. You can answer me. Who do they work for? Yes, they work for city government. They are government employees. And so there's a clear model here of accountability. Government is both the policymaker and the service provider. But over time, we have a whole variety of other models that have been put into place, particularly in the social service arena, by the way, in which we contract out public services. And contract out, I'd like to make that distinction between contract out and real privatization. Real privatization is when you say, government doesn't do this anymore, we want the private sector to do it. When you contract out, you're basically saying government still has a role in this service delivery arena, but we're not going to be the direct service delivery provider. So there's all kinds of challenges that emerge in the public policy arena when you deal with contractors. What is the major reason for contracting out a service as opposed to doing it in-house or having a government worker do the service? What would be, from the perspective of a policy student, why would you do that? Again, not a trick question. Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, it may be because, number one, to maximize the efficiency, to be more accountable and transparent in that way, and to take the advantage of the pool of resources which are available outside the public.
Exactly. So the idea is you're going to get, the idea is to improve the service. It would be, the model has to assume that it can be done better by using this pool of contractors out there. Whatever better means is a different question. So that's a critical part of the contracting out assumption. It's very rare that we actually test that model of whether or not you get a better service by contracting out or not. But particularly in these new policy areas where local government is taking a lead and they don't have an existing workforce, it certainly makes sense to work with this contract community. Well, there are all kinds of challenges there because if you contract out and if you want it to work, we've got a couple of lessons out there right now from previous national policy. What has to be the case on the government side? What does government have to be able to do if this contracting process is going to work? Yeah, who said it? Yes, they have to be in a position to monitor. Somebody's got to set standards. There has to be some evaluation mechanism. So they have to have an oversight capacity, right? So, you know, we have big national examples of this from Hurricane Katrina, from the war in Iraq, with all of these government contracts with very little capacity. We have it in the Food and Drug Administration now. You name it. If you gut government bureaucracy and you contract out, who's minding the store? How do we know we're getting anything for our contracts? So there's this real fallacy out there in the world of oversight, in the world of government, in the world of understanding the private versus the public. Yes, you may decide for the reasons you articulated that it's better to contract out. But if it's still a public function, if there's still a role for government, government better have the capacity to do the oversight, or you're not going to know what happened to that money out there or whether you got anything you bargained for. So this is a system, as we'll see down the road, that had that challenge from the beginning, which is, and by the way, this is not a criticism of the contractor community. You know, contractors can be doing a fabulous job, but if you don't have the mechanisms in place to report back what is actually going on and what they've produced, for example, in this case, how many jobs were people placed in? If you can't articulate that, how do you know that what you spent your money on was worth the value to begin with? So it is to say that we want to put in standards of evaluation and we want to shore up government's capacity to do oversight is not a criticism of the contractor community. It has to be done hand in hand. Government cannot do that effectively without working very closely with the contract community and also very closely with in this instance, the job seekers, people who are the clients of this particular service. So there was a mandate, right? A very clear mandate from the federal government about what workforce development policy was supposed to look like on the ground. And the one thing that I would add to this description is, I think, something very interesting about workforce development policy in particular, as opposed to the general issues that will come up from this case study about innovation and about government policy. Workforce development policy doesn't really fall into any one of the traditional policy arenas. At times it's been claimed by education, sometimes by labor, sometimes it's been considered a social service. I see my good friend Ray Linevsky smiling. I know I hit something. and sometimes economic development policy. I would suggest to you, as policymakers, as students of public policy, as potential practitioners out there, that how you frame the policy question will have an impact on your ability to get the work done on the ground. So framing policy has a politics of its own. And in this particular policy area, this has been a burden to the people trying to do the work in this field over and over again. Whether you think about it as education policy or social service or economic development, you can see how that will impact who's willing to come to the table and be a partner. You know, business, I'll give you a great example. Business, when they do social services, that's usually part of their philanthropy arm. They're not doing social services as part of their bottom line. So for business to be comfortable in the workforce development arena, they've got to understand that it's part of economic development policy, that it's not a social service per se. So you've got, and yet you have clients who may have social service needs before they can get into the workforce. So you have a very interesting set of questions that you have to deal with from the get-go in this policy arena. Now, this case study, as you know, is focusing on the New York City workforce development policy and what, after all this work we've done, we view as the successful restructuring that began under Mayor Michael Bloomberg's administration in 2003. And what we think happened here is that a system which we saw was basically out of compliance with federal regulations, I'll sort of lay this out on the table for you, and probably deemed one of the worst workforce development systems in the country, turns into something that we consider to be a national model now. I would suggest to you all that the restructuring here and why this is a great case study for a politics of policy class to look at was not without political or operational conflict. To innovate, to do a successful restructuring, I can't think of one example that just happens in the political arena without any conflict. And there was plenty of conflict in this particular area. Now, to really understand what happened, what we want to do here very briefly, and then take your questions, is examine the conditions that led to the dissolution of a city agency that was in charge of implementing the Workforce Investment Act. In New York City, that was the Department of Employment. It was completely eliminated. Highly unusual, but something that really does affect restructuring directly. If you eliminate a department and you still have a function to do, you've got to find another place for that work to get done. So you are pushing the envelope when it comes to innovation by that kind of simple restructuring. It sounds very basic, but very unusual for government to completely eliminate an agency. The other thing that happened was the restoration of the Workforce Investment Board, which was a very important and key actor in creating workforce investment policy and part of the WIA mandate. Eventually, the transfer of responsibility and federal workforce funds to the Department of Small Business Services. We have our witness here to the great transfer, Commissioner Rob Walsh, and also to the Department of Youth and Community Development. WIA funds adult workforce and youth workforce. We're going to focus today primarily on the adult piece. The youth is equally as important and has, I think, equally as a dramatic story to tell here, but it really was too much to do in one case study. And what we will do is conclude by looking at what's happening on the ground right now in the workforce development system in New York and what are the challenges moving forward, which Commissioner Walsh will spend his time focusing on those two aspects of the case study. So let me quickly give you some of the background here. That is to say, the story. And it's kind of nice when you have also not just facts, but a story to tell. the story usually illustrates the political questions in a much more direct way. And so I'll try and be as succinct as I can about the story. The story really starts in the Giuliani years. Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York City before Michael Bloomberg. And so that whatever the conditions of the workforce development system were that Bloomberg had to confront, they were essentially inherited from the work that was done in the Giuliani years. Now, for most of the Giuliani years, the city's workforce system operated under the previous legislation, the JTPA legislation. And to be perfectly blunt, some of you who know me know that I have that capacity. I know I'm, kind of like a wallflower in the corner sometimes, but I try very hard to break out of that shell so I can be perfectly blunt, and we'll do it now. The administration under Giuliani simply had no interest in workforce development policy as it was articulated in WIA. It essentially left the Department of Employment, the city agency which was responsible for the implementation of the Workforce Investment Act in New York, with weak leadership, no direction, and no policy vision. And it left it nominally, and I say nominally, in charge of this system, because what's so fascinating about what happened in the Giuliani administration is that for a time, the federal government actually believed that New York was so uninterested in workforce development policy that they would not even spend the WIA allocation, which is highly unusual for federal money to come into a city and for that money to be left on the table. And the New York Times reported in 2000 that the city was actually in jeopardy of losing millions of dollars in the first installment of the Workforce Investment Act because they had essentially not put the structures in place to implement the workforce investment policy under WIA. What had essentially happened, it wasn't that the Giuliani people were not interested in putting people to work. They were primarily interested in welfare reform. And the activities of welfare reform happened under the auspices of the Human Resources Administration. And their policy under Mayor Giuliani's commissioner, Jason Turner, was something called Work First, which I won't go into in any detail. But the idea of workforce was simply get people into the workforce. The Giuliani administration did not really believe in any kind of serious job training, in the idea that you could do career paths for people, or that education should be an avenue toward job placement. It was get people into the workforce. It's a model. It's out there a lot of, in the welfare world, it's part of a broader conversation. What had happened in New York was that the Adult Workforce Investment Act money was transferred over to the Human Resources Administration and essentially became part of the welfare system. So this made it virtually impossible for the Department of Employment to articulate any kind of serious workforce development policy because they essentially lost control over much of the funding. And what happened to this funding, and to be clear, the WIA Act says that you can place people either who are unemployed or who are from the welfare system. So legitimately, you could use WIA money for welfare recipients. What most jurisdictions tried to do was use this money to target non-welfare recipients because there was a different chunk of money in the welfare system. So there's an argument to be made for integrating workforce for all populations, but what had essentially happened is the only population that got targeted were welfare recipients. At the end of the day, what really shakes this system at its very core is September 11th. And ironically, one of the one of the outcomes of the September 11th crisis in New York City, of course, is a lot of displaced and unemployed workers from both high-end jobs in Wall Street, but also from a lot of low-end entry-level jobs or supportive employment jobs. So we had a big recession, high-level unemployment post 9/11. Moreover, we had the need to really address workforce issues very directly, very quickly, and what became very clear was we didn't have a significant workforce system in place. And so that became a sort of catalyst for a public discussion around workforce issues by the state and the federal government, as well as some of the advocacy community in New York. Fast forward, it's not so fast forward, the Bloomberg administration comes into office in January of 2002, very close, right, to the outcomes from the 9/11 crisis, having a huge number of things to deal with at that point in time, but realizing that workforce is very important, a very important issue. And, you know, they begin to look for the workforce system in New York City. And I don't mean to be cavalier about it, but truth in advertising, I was one of those people who started to look for the workforce system because of the 9/11 crisis. And that's how I became interested in it. And the mayor appointed a new commissioner at the Department of Employment who came from the business world and who really understood this model of linking workforce to economic development and had, I think, an agenda that was very consistent with the larger Bloomberg agenda of accountability and using technology to manage for results. But I think the problem was so deep at this point that it was very difficult for her, I believe, to move the dime really effectively in this system. So the interesting question, I think, for our class to focus on partly also becomes, you know something doesn't work. How do you fix it? What are the opportunities for innovation? What are the politics around being innovative at a time in which you realize that you have a policy area that you have to work on and that you want to put something in place that actually can focus on the problem at hand, but things are not happening quickly enough, and that what you have in place in terms of infrastructure is really quite inadequate. In the final analysis, City Hall determined that it made sense for small business services to take over adult workforce development programming, because if it was really capable of implementing this Bloomberg agenda. SBS was already engaged in working with the city's business community, and they required a partner that could really bring the workforce system closer to the needs of the business community. So moving adult WIA funding to SBS would also place the program in an agency that reported to the deputy mayor, who was responsible for economic development. So when you think about structural changes, all of those things are critical. Previously, the Department of Employment reported to the mayor, who was responsible for social services and a broad range of other things, but not in the mainstream of the economic development agenda. The idea here was symbolically simply to signal to the business community that City Hall was serious about changing the direction of policy, with new leadership dedicated to approaching workforce development as an economic development strategy. So it was critically important to reframe the policy before you could even change the operations on the ground. The fascinating thing about this restructuring is usually you have a lot of time to do that, and you want to bring in all of your key players and work through that policy initiative with them. In truth, there wasn't a lot of time here, and that SBS had to hit the ground running. One of the things that I want to impress upon you, because you someday will be in this position that you have to think about, when you do a restructuring on paper and you frame a policy, please bear in mind two things. Somebody's got to implement that on the ground, okay? Somebody has to make it work on the ground. So you have to pay attention to systems and operations and all those mundane things that some people who are sort of at the macro level of policy are not that enthusiastic about. But also the fascinating thing here is an entire department was taken down, essentially eliminated. The work couldn't stop. You couldn't just go out there and say, okay, everybody waiting for workforce development services, we're changing this system now. We're giving it to 2 other agencies. We're going to have a whole new model, and we're going to create all these new centers on the ground. So we're going to suspend training programs and workforce policy for the next year while we get this up and running. So this is the thing that people do not think about and do not realize and do not build into the restructuring, which is particularly, and we have a couple of people here who were in the belly of the beast and had to do this at the same time, both from a vendor perspective, the people who were setting up the new workforce centers. I hope you get to meet them and talk to them. They are the heroes here. And also on the agency side, setting up the infrastructure for SBS to do the critical kinds of oversight that I'm talking about. So this was part of the key challenge, I believe. And this is the point in which I'd like to pass the baton over to my dear friend and former colleague, Professor, I'm turning you into a professor. That's not so good, right?
Okay.
Commissioner.
What's the salary?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't even want to go there. Commissioner Robert Walsh, who really was the leader for this extraordinary restructuring. When you read the case study, you'll understand how important leadership is in this restructuring. We had leadership from City Hall, from the mayor, and as importantly, we had leadership from the agency who was responsible for doing this work on the ground, and that's Commissioner Rob Walsh. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Esther. I have never heard you describe yourself as a wallflower. I've never heard anybody describe you as a wallflower. No one will ever, that's for sure. There was a lot of memories flooding back when Esther was talking about the turnaround of the workforce system. I couldn't help but think, starting with the mayor, his legacy in this city and some of the things he tackled head on. We know about the smoking bill, and he took a courageous stand on the smoking bill, that's for sure. Certainly on 311. And, there's people in the audience here who will tell you, when you take an agency that's been around for decades, and I mean decades, and you look to eliminate it and you say it hasn't been working and turn it around, I think this is one of the, fascinating policy questions you have. You end up eliminating, there's going to be a lot of people at your doorstep. And there's a number of people who have been on the Workforce Investment Board who are shaking their head, who, will confirm that. I can remember that first week. What do you mean the mayor is going to be eliminating the agency? This was an agency that was placing 126 people a quarter in jobs. Today we're placing over 4,500 people a quarter for the last 10 consecutive quarters. What's not in the case study, and I have to tell you that a lot of what we did was infusing the agency with a good deal of talent, and it started with David Margalit, who was the deputy commissioner of the agency. David is one of the smartest guys that I've ever had the opportunity to work with, and he was the architect, along with Kevin Kelly, who's also in the audience, putting this together. I remember the blood, sweat, and tears that they put into it, and I mean blood, sweat, and tears in putting it together. And now it's Angie Kamath, who is our deputy commissioner, who has taken the baton and has run with it. And I think if there's lessons learned through this case study, the first would be surround yourself with great people, infuse the place with a lot of talent and energy, And if you really take a look at, what we had to start with, one, we had Ester. And, Ester was someone who was always looking out for you. She watched, my back at City Hall and a constituency that I did not know much about, quite frankly. My background, if you start looking at the different policy areas, and I was listening intently, I'm an economic development guy. Someone who worked with business improvement districts on economic development and urban planning. This was a foreign language for me in many cases. And what I learned about Ester was someone who was fierce, who was passionate, who was smart, and was always going to be at your side in making this thing happen. And that's exactly what happened in the beginning, starting with the mayor, followed by Ester, and then there's a number of people in this audience who were just spectacular. There's a gentleman by the name of Rocco D'Amato in this audience who is a successful businessman who took a chance in Hunts Point to run his business. He was in Tribeca before it was cool, okay? Making it happen, and he's one of the guys who really pioneered and turned that neighborhood around. And I remember after my first WIB meeting, my first meeting with you, Rocco, you basically told me you were going to give me your resignation. You had it with the Workforce Development Program. I said, give us a chance. And he did. And another gentleman by the name of Rex Davidson, who is the president and CEO of Goodwill Industries. I convinced Rex to take a shot at one of our RFPs for a new Brooklyn center that we would run. I told Rex it would be better than ever. It would follow a model that the mayor had talked to a lot of his commissioners about, is customer service, have professional standards, turn people through the system really quickly, and have something at the end. And if you go out to 9 Bond Street on the 5th floor, right off the Fulton Mall, you'll see miracles taking place, because that's what Rex Davidson has been doing. It is a center that's been visited by a number of mayors throughout this country and leaders in this country, and it's something we've been able to replicate in other parts of the city. And then there was John Toomey. John, there was that national conference that we had in Boston. I remember coming down that escalator. I think it was at the Marriott, right? And I see John Toomey, an advocate for workforce. Oh, my goodness. I wanted to do everything to avoid this guy and just run home. And John said, this was about 5 years ago, it will be okay. And he's been our advocate. And, recently we got an infusion of money, given the crisis that we have on Wall Street and in the city, of $5 million to help build our systems and build out our programs. And it's guys like, John Toomey. And, of course, Ray Linevsky. She's been in the battlegrounds, and she knows the system. She knows what works. She knows what doesn't work. And she'll tell you. And she'll tell you, pretty directly. Sometimes you don't want to hear it, but she'll tell you very, very directly. The wallflower, sure. And I think these were the key things to be done. So the talent, the energy, and getting the commitment, not only from staff inside, but it was so important to have a core and a constituency on the outside that you could end up turning to. And I think that was one of the key things of turning things around. Dr. Fuchs talked about systems, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of that. And I learned a lot from a guy by the name of Kevin Kelly on doing this. Kevin is one of the guys who keeps pounding away at it. Every time we steer off course, it's back to the basics. I can remember my first meeting with the managers at the Department of Employment at the time when we were starting to talk about the changes that were going to take place. Your agency is going to be eliminated. You're going over to the other side, economic development, and you're going to like it. Now tell me what you do. And people went around the room. I'm not kidding. This is a true story. And they ended up talking about handing out applications for food stamps, important. Applications for voter registration forms, important. Developing partnerships in neighborhoods, important. Nobody talked about jobs. Nobody talked about jobs. And it was people like Kevin Kelly and David Margolin and now Angie Kamath and others who put systems in place and getting things to a point where we can go to businesses and tell the businesses, we can end up saving you time and money. Now, what does that mean? How do we end up saving companies time and money? It's a lot less time. I had a guy in today who's opening up in Chelsea, a cheese factory. Can you believe that, Rocco? In Chelsea. Right? 100 people. I asked David Margaret to come in and start talking with the gentleman about some of the programs we have on training. He expressed interest because we could end up saving him time and money for him to grow in the city. And if we could end up doing our work in preparation of people for those jobs, we'll have many more people lined up. And I think that's well documented in the case study of the companies that have now come to the city of New York for help with jobs. And you think about it, we're at a disadvantage in some cases because the disadvantage was we did not do our job very well in the past. So when you have failed in the past, it's hard to get the client, it's hard to get the customer to come back at you. And that's exactly one of the challenges that we've been working at. I think the other reason that we've been successful is we've been not shy about looking at best practices throughout the country. We are constantly, and I think this is one of the things that the alum of this program, Stephanie Martinez and Melinda Malacca and the staff there, has done very well. If something is working well in Chicago or Atlanta or San Diego, we are happy to steal it. We are happy to adopt it. We are happy to get on a plane to take a look at something and make it work. And I think that's one of the examples of that is a program that we now have out in Queens where we're focusing primarily on the transportation sector, the jobs around the airport, directly or indirectly. And that's something that we have learned through work that John has done, work that has taken place in other parts of the country of adopting best practices, and I think that's important. I think another one of the key pieces, and I'll stop on this and move into what's next, is like anything when you start talking about policy. I think it's important, and I think this is one of the hard things to do, is to often take a step back and assess your system. And this is one of the things that Deputy Commissioner Angie Kamath does very well, bringing her team together and saying, let's take a step back. Are we working at our highest standards possible? And this is one of the things that we're doing now, and it's one of the things that the mayor has asked us to do very recently, given the situation that we have on Wall Street and throughout the city. Is how could we make it better? What could be improved? How could we turn around faster? How could we get more companies coming to our system? Are we serving the people who are coming in? What's the retention rate like? Is our technology at its very best? And the answer to all those questions is no, 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 no. And this is something that drives us and pushes us, and I think my hope is many of you stay afterwards and meet some of the people who are very committed to this. Because there's people like Matt White and other people in this room who I've mentioned already who really drive and make this system work. I think going forward, and I think the key challenge is going forward, I think we're in an extraordinary place right now. We have a mayor who has strongly supported this link between economic development and workforce development in the city of New York to help build communities and help build people and help reposition people whose jobs have ended. We're in the process of putting together a number of new initiatives in that area, but I think this is one of the key things in terms of how we could end up contributing to a new administration in Washington. Esther made reference to it in her opening remarks and in the case study. And I was listening, early on. I was cheating a little bit, sitting in the back row. Is what can we end up contributing from here? And many of you are going to be doing new case studies. I heard that part of the assignment. But if you look around, take a look. Take a look at the workforce systems throughout the country. Who has it the best? Who has figured it out? My friends, not too many cities have figured this out. And I think the lessons learned in New York of bringing together and developing a demand-driven system is something that we could end up, quite frankly, contributing to the debate. As President Obama, it's sort of nice to say, isn't it? Starts thinking about workforce programs and job programs and how you end up repositioning the whole jobs agenda as we go forward. It's been tough for us. I talked about that great turnaround, and Esther wrote about it. And you look at the numbers. 2001, our allocation was at $80 million. 2008, it's down to $54 million on jobs program. But during that time, we managed to take it from 3 centers that were marginal at best to 8 centers. We have plans for 12 centers now, even during the toughest times. I keep looking at Angie. She keeps looking back at me, and knowing that, boy, we have a lot to do over the next couple of months. But during the tough times, and I think during the toughest of times, you get some of the best work. I think there's one other piece that I don't want to forget, and I'll close on this to give people a chance to share their thoughts and questions. I think we often talk about placement, and I often do. I want to know, how we're doing at the different centers. We meet with the different contractors on a regular basis. We're getting better at it, but I think there's a lot more work that we need to be doing on training and working with companies, on training. And I think that's one of the things as we go forward, not only with the schools, the vocational schools and commercial schools we work with, but other programs that we have where we work with the private sector. I'm going to wrap it up on that because my guess is there's probably people who want to ask questions or jump in on a discussion on this. But I have to tell you, I'll emphasize it again. One is, a big thanks to, people who had the courage to step forward on this, starting with Esther, and the people who carry this program day in and day out, Dave and Angie and so many other people in this audience today. Thank you.
There are a couple of microphones here, so don't be shy. Both students and guests, we would like you to ask questions. If you don't have any offhand, if you turn to page 31 of the case study, there's a whole lot of questions that we've come up with over there that you can think of. So please come up and ask some questions, okay? We don't want to waste too much time. Come on. I see you wanting to get up. Do you rather just stand up? We're taping, so. I never knew Columbia students to be so shy. Am I going to have to sit here and ask Rob questions? Come on, Professor Lieberman. Okay. Do you want to go to the mic? Thank you. Other people can get up at the other mics and get ready.
Hello, is it on?
Yeah. Yes, otherwise I'm going to have to call on everybody whose name I know.
Okay, so my question is, it's very interesting, the workforce. I come from the Middle East, and we have, this problem about training people and putting them in the right jobs. But with regards to New York and the financial crisis and losing all these jobs, how does that impact all the work that you've done? How can you secure jobs when there's no jobs how are you going to create more jobs for these people and small businesses?
It's a good question. In some cases, we're not going to be able to. One of the things that I'll give you a couple of examples of how we're helping. we're in the process of putting together a virtual one-stop for the financial sector, where people could end up finding about other jobs, but not only other jobs, but about health insurance, unemployment insurance, leads to perhaps other careers, training, networking, opportunities, with other people. We're not going to be replacing those jobs immediately. We're kidding ourselves. But what we will be doing every step of the way is whatever we can do to get people back to work, and perhaps it's not at the salaries that they were at, but in other opportunities.
And I would just add one thing at this point. One of the, I think, most creative things about this policy is, again, it's linking the workforce with economic development. So there are, even though we're in an economic decline period right now, the economy will turn around. There will be job growth again. And so part of it is being a little bit proactive. Where do you do your training? Which are the sectors? Do you want to target the resources that you have? So while you want to put some people back to work immediately because they can and they have the skill set and there are other opportunities for them in other fields, it might not be in financial services, but they may end up in healthcare in a high-level position that uses the same skill set. We want to also be thinking about, and what SBS has done, I think, very effectively, is start to do the sector strategy. So I thought the example, Rob, that you gave about the transportation sector around the airports, how to increase the number of job opportunities in that field, which we know will be growing over time. So what we can't do at the local level of government is smooth out economic cycles. So, city governments cannot smooth out economic cycles. They are, in many ways, the victim of larger national economic trends. But what we can do here is, A, be competitive, which is to say, make New York City the place where businesses want to locate and where people want to come and live and work, and continue to do that and not jeopardize that. And that's been a part of the mayor's agenda that Rob's agency has been such a critical part of. We don't want to go backwards the way we did in the 1975 fiscal crisis and just continue to hemorrhage people and jobs. So part of it is just keeping it stable and anticipating that you be ready when the growth starts to turn around also.
I want to go back at your question because in some ways I feel like my answer was a cop-out too, and I don't want to leave you with that. The people who are being laid off on Wall Street, the bankers, are not going to come to our career centers. Okay, let's be clear about that.
You never know. Stranger things have happened.
I don't see it.
Right.
We are working with the Partnership for New York. We've been in touch with places like Career Builders and Craigslist and The Vault and a number of other groups. That's where they will go. Many of the people who come into our centers, if you looked at it a third, and Rex Davison probably could give a whole lecture on this, we see many people who do not have high school degrees, probably a third of that population, maybe less, Rex. A third of people who have high school degrees or associate degrees, and then a third, and we're seeing more and more people with college degrees who are coming in, not just for assessment and orientation, but to use our services, whether it's training or computer labs and banks that we have that people could use freely. But on those big ticket jobs, I don't see a massive number of people coming in to use our centers.
Professor Lieberman?
I want to ask a couple of questions that are specifically about the politics of this policy transformation that that you're describing in the case.
There were no politics.
No, of course not. Yeah. There never are, except there always are.
Yeah.
You both talked about the importance of the relationship between the department and allies in City Hall, Ester and others. So I wonder if you could talk about why that kind of, why being out in a department, why having an ally in the mayor's office was so important, number one. And on the flip side of that, as you were trying to do this, trying to implement a new policy that sort of exposed the flaws of the old policy, that's sort of inherent in what you were trying to do, where were the biggest obstacles that you faced? Who were the people and who were the groups either inside the city government or outside, interest groups or actors outside of government? Who were the biggest obstacles that you faced in trying to do that? And how did you, in sort of in alliance with the mayor's office, get around these or over or through these obstacles?
That's a great question.
Those are. Leave it to the professor to ask me questions like that. There was a time that I felt that some of the biggest obstacles that we had were many of the nonprofit workforce organizations that were scattered around the 5 boroughs, who were looking at what we were doing in creating these career centers and were concerned about it. They were concerned about it because if we were investing our money and our resources and our talent and our technology into building out career centers throughout the 5 boroughs, that meant they would be getting less of the pie. And then they were seeing the cuts that were taking place in the federal government. As Kevin Kelly and David Margalit and now Angie build out systems that hold contractors and vendors accountable for placements and are following up with retention, similar to what the police commissioner does with his commanding officers, and they bring them together on a regular basis and hold them accountable to their placement numbers. That means you can't fudge the numbers anymore, and you can't be sort of calling, sort of dialing for dollars in a sense of placements. There was a time, quite frankly, where, we were just asking for a list. It wasn't whether you placed the person, whether the person got the job. And I think the system, think about that. We would have people calling. You were at our center. How did you do? I got a job as a flight attendant. Well, we had nothing to do with flight attendant jobs, but it didn't matter. We checked it off, and that took place. Many people came into our centers by busloads from the vocational schools and the commercial schools, and they were dropped off in Harlem at 125th Street, and they went upstairs and they got a training voucher for $5,000. The schools didn't want to see change. They were in the workforce system. They had a glossy brochure. They advertised on the subways. And the advertisements often said the government was, basically giving away free money. They called it financial aid. Who were we cheating there? We were cheating the people who were going to those centers who weren't being trained for a job. But the vocational schools were very good about reporting numbers, and not necessarily about placement in those areas where they necessarily changed. Those things have changed. So in some ways, Ray and Rex and John probably could have this, debate and talk about this. My hope is they'll jump in. Is you're shaking up a system. You're shaking up a system that had a little bit of accountability on performing, and that was tough. What was the other parts of the question?
What did you do about it? How did you get around it?
Systems, accountability. And we're still doing this. We're, bringing people in on a regular basis. We eliminated many contracts, and many contracts that had, in the past, a political flavor to them. And that's where it's nice to have an ally in City Hall. We're about to eliminate this contract. They didn't do anything, they did not place people in, or they did not hit their goals, or what they said they were going to do in the contract. Is it okay? Of course it's okay.
I'll jump in just to add to this point because, I mean, you're hitting a very, very important question that people have to understand, you know, won't operate the same way unless you have sort of directions from the top, or at least even if you don't have directions, you know there's a comfort level with the policy agenda from the top, whether it's a president or a mayor or a governor. And I think in this instance, what part of the save here was once systems got put into place that could actually look at outcomes and look at number of people that were actually being placed in jobs as a result of training with these contractors, it became a little bit more difficult for political folks to come in and say, why are you cutting my contract? When you had the numbers in front of you and you could say, excuse me, it's all well and good that you're training people, but your training is not producing the job placements. It's an extraordinary thing. I personally had a very hard time actually believing what I was seeing, that job placement wasn't an outcome measure, wasn't for the purposes of paying these contractors, but it hadn't been. And so in the Bloomberg administration, which is so oriented toward outcomes, toward evaluation, toward documenting this so that you can actually say, this is what we're doing and this is what we're getting for our money, you know, it became very hard for political folks to protect contractors who are not producing for their constituencies, to be honest. So in the past, where people would say, you know, this is my guy, he's in my neighborhood, and, you know, I worry about him, we could kind of say, aren't you worried about the people in your community who are taking these classes and not really getting jobs as a result of these classes? So there is a way to make an argument on the merits. It's not that without the political support, the merits win. But if you have the argument on the merits and you have the data, then you have a better than fighting chance in this kind of a political environment where you had a mayor that actually cared about that to be effective. And that empowers commissioners like Rob Walsh. And that's part of the political story. You can have a great commissioner who leads a kind of innovation. If they're not empowered by the mayor or the governor or the president, whoever it is, to do that work, to stand up and say it's a different game on the ground now, then it is very hard to do that.
And it starts here. I mean, it's hard to believe this document did not exist or anything like this existed. And we did not have the accountability to do this. And Esther's right. You know, it starts right at the top. And I knew, you know, that when I made a decision to eliminate a contract, and in some cases long-standing contracts, that I was going to get the backing of the mayor because I'd seen it before with him. What are the numbers? Are they doing the job? If they're not doing the job, make a change.
We have, we have two more. Let's take two more questions. Why don't you, Rachel, why don't you ask your question, and then we'll have John.
My question is sort of piggybacking on what you were just talking about, and you mentioned the Department of Employment and the, you know, it was sort of not working as well as it should have been before. But
it's an understatement.
Why? Can you talk a little bit about why they decided to eliminate that entire department? Why not go in there and clean it up versus scrapping it? You know, because wouldn't there have been things that would have, you know, could have been saved if it stayed there?
I'm not, you know, I hid under my desk for 3 days, you know, when Esther had mentioned this, and a number of other people at City Hall, so it's her fault, not mine. You know, I had a nice little boutique agency, 107 people. We were doing fine.
See, he's very modest. I think the reality is that at a certain point what happens is that an agency loses its legitimacy or its credibility to get the work done. So as hard as somebody might work, in a way you sort of have to start new and start fresh. And I think part of the problem was the Department of Employment was sort of in the wrong sector in terms of reporting, so it wasn't part of economic development, so it was hard for them to make that linkage. It was still viewed as sort of a quasi-social service agency, so business wasn't really that interested in working with them and didn't really believe they could do the work. I think that was the major reason. And there was also a budget crisis then. And so when you have those kinds of forces combining, this was a way for OMB to save money. That allowed the policy argument to actually dominate. One of the really interesting things about the restructuring that I didn't mention earlier is that HRA, the Human Resources Administration, was actually poised to take the adult workforce program, the WIA money, because they had had it before and they had systems in place. And OMB was actually fine about giving it to them because they knew they could at least get the money out on the ground and do something. And one of the big worries is you don't want to lose your federal dollars if you can't make the system work at all. So to give it to SBS was a risk on some level because they did not have the same kinds of systems in place. They had no federal dollars. They were a completely tax levy agency. But at the end, I really believe it was the policy argument that prevailed, one, and two, the belief that there was a commissioner at that agency who wasn't afraid to innovate and wasn't afraid to do the hard work and had just demonstrated that in working with the business improvement districts and already cleaning up what he already was doing. So there were, in the end, I'd have to say the policy argument succeeded. I can't tell you that the policy argument will always succeed, but in this instance it did. Why don't we take the last question from John?
Well, Professor, I think you asked a really good question, your first question. Your second question was good too, but the first question is a good question.
Thanks. I'm glad you're not
the best answer to the first question was probably given by Machiavelli in 1512 when he said, "Woe to the proponent of a new system, for he gets only lukewarm support for those who might gain and full-blown enmity from all who think they might lose." And so for what these guys did, and they did a brilliant job, but without big friends in City Hall, it's hard to do that because there's a lot of pushback.
Thank you, John. Actually, I think that's a perfect point in which to end. Everybody should be reading The Prince. Thank you very much.
We'll have to assign the Prince in this course next year. I want to thank Professor Fuchs and Commissioner Walsh for a terrific case study and a great session.